Less than a month ago, the Church of England decided to allow women to become bishops. Now, this is interesting because within the last year, Pope Francis, who's supposedly a liberalizing figure within the Roman Catholic Church, stated that the Catholic Church was under no circumstances going to allow female ordination. The language he used was that the door was closed to that possibility. Now, what was he referring to when he said that? Probably he was referring to this apostolic letter of Pope John Paul II, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. It was written in 1994, 2 years after the General Synod of the Church of England passed a vote to ordain women as priests, if not as bishops. It was also the same year that England's first two female priests were ordained. In this document, Pope John Paul II lays down infallibly why the Church cannot and thus will not ever ordain a woman. Theologians like Richard McBrien will try to cast doubt on the infallibility of this document. That seems doomed to failure. In October 28th of 1995, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, headed up by the prefect Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, whom you may have heard of, officially stated that yes, this teaching requires definitive assent. The teaching that the Church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women is to be understood as belonging to the deposit of faith. It has been set forth infallibly by the ordinary and universal magisterium, and it specifies that the sovereign pontiff John Paul II approved this and ordered it to be published. So obviously the Pope thought so. Obviously John Paul II thought that this was infallible. This reply was accompanied by a letter by Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, which also states, "The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, with the approval of the Holy Father, has given an official reply on the nature of this assent. It is a matter of full, definitive assent, that is to say, irrevocable, to a doctrine taught infallibly by the Church. It has been set forth infallibly by the ordinary universal magisterium. In this case, an act of the ordinary papal magisterium, in itself not infallible, witnesses to the infallibility of the teaching of a doctrine already possessed by the Church." This is fairly unambiguous, and it would seem that the current pontiff, Pope Francis, would also agree that this is an infallible, unchangeable teaching. Why? Why is that? In order to understand, you have to read the document itself, which doesn't take very long. In fact, it can almost be disappointing how simple it initially seems when you first read it. It doesn't argue that the sacrament of priesthood has some kind of essentially masculine character. It doesn't fall back on the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, who also argued against female ordination. It doesn't even appeal to the writings of St. Paul in the Holy Scriptures, where he forbade women from becoming priests. It doesn't even mention St. Paul, except maybe very, very indirectly at one point. No, it's centered entirely on Jesus Christ. It's so brief, and I think it's so to the point, because it's saying that all of this other discussion is incidental to the main reason why the Catholic Church does not ordain women as priests, because Jesus Christ didn't. Now, how strong of an argument is that? Well, let's look at the document itself to discover why. Notice, though, the document does draw on other sources, which it intends for the reader to look up for themselves, that do go into a little bit more detail about why perhaps this is the case, why Jesus did not ordain women as priests. But the document itself says, regardless of those reasons, however strong or weak they may be, the essential thing is that he didn't, and that's normative for us. Let's look at the document itself and discover how strong of a piece of argumentation that really is. The letter begins, "Venerable brothers in the episcopate, priestly ordination, which hands on the office entrusted by Christ to his apostles of teaching, sanctifying, and governing the faithful, has, in the Catholic Church, from the beginning, always been reserved to men alone. This tradition has also been faithfully maintained by the Oriental churches. When the question of the ordination of women arose in the Anglican Communion, Pope Paul VI, out of fidelity to his office of safeguarding the apostolic tradition, and also with a view to removing a new obstacle placed in the way of Christian unity, reminded Anglicans of the position of the Catholic Church. She holds that it is not admissible to ordain women to the priesthood for very fundamental reasons. These reasons include the example recorded in the sacred scriptures of Christ choosing his apostles only from among men, the constant practice of the Church, which has imitated Christ in choosing only men, and her living teaching authority, which has consistently held that the exclusion of women from the priesthood is in accordance with God's plan for his Church. But since the question had also become the subject of debate among theologians and in certain Catholic circles, Paul VI directed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to set forth and expound the teaching of the Church on this matter. This was done in the declaration Inter Insignores, which the Supreme Pontiff approved and ordered to be published. To understand what the sacrament is and should be, we have to look at how its founder used it, what he intended for it, what the dominical precedent is. Any theologizing we do about the sacrament of holy orders has to come out of what Jesus actually did. It can't be that we imagine what it should be and then try to explain Jesus' actions in the light of that. Notice also how the Pope frames this discussion, and how Pope Paul VI framed this discussion. This is an issue of church unity, and this is a question for Anglicans and for any other church that's interested in reunion with the Catholic Church. Is the question of women's ordination more important to you than the unity of Christ's Church? Now, one could turn that around and say, well, is it more important to you to forbid women to become priests than it is to achieve church unity? Well, what's at issue here, though, is that the Church is imitating Christ, and for the Catholic Church, imitating Christ and following his example is what church unity should look like. It's not something to be sacrificed in favor of church unity. And if some other congregation or denomination wants to change that, wants to break from Christ's precedent, and then insist that on church unity, well, the question has to be asked, is church unity less important to you than the ordination of women? Notice the way the Pope phrases it. He mentions the constant practice of the Church, which has imitated Christ in choosing only men. Now, we know about the imitation of Christ, but people often just think that means imitating his moral example. But if Christ founded a church, and he had his own design for that church, isn't the most sensible way to govern it in accordance with Christ's will simply to imitate what he did? Wouldn't that also be part of the imitation of Christ? The document here that Pope John Paul II cites is Paul VI's response to the letter of His Grace the Most Reverend Dr. F.D. Coggan, Archbishop of Canterbury, concerning the ordination of women to the priesthood, from November 30th, 1975. 1975 was a similarly important touchstone year, let's say, for the Anglican Church in regards to this question of the ordination of women, like 1994 was. In 1974, in the United States, 11 women were ordained to the priesthood in Philadelphia by 3 retired Episcopal Church bishops. They were known as the Philadelphia 11. The ordinations were regularized in 1976 following the approval by the General Convention of measures to provide for the ordination of women to the priesthood and the episcopate. Now, 1975, of course, falls right in between those. The Pope wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury right when the Church in America was deliberating over whether to regularize the ordination of these 11 women. Inter Insignores was published in 1976, in the year those ordinations are recognized by the Episcopal Church. John Paul II goes on to quote from it some more. The declaration recalls and explains the fundamental reasons for this teaching, reasons expounded by Paul VI, and concludes that the Church, quote, does not consider herself authorized to admit women to priestly ordination, unquote. This is really important language. The question is, why won't the Church decide to ordain women? The issue is that the Church doesn't think it's been authorized to ordain women. Everything the Church gives is received ultimately from Christ, which is why Christ's example and his precedent matter so much in this issue. In fact, they're the essential parts of this issue. To these fundamental reasons, JP2 continues, the document adds other theological reasons which illustrate the appropriateness of the divine provision. And it also shows that Christ's way of acting did not proceed from sociological or cultural motives peculiar to his time. This is really important as well. There are other theological reasons, but the fundamental reason, as it says, is that Christ didn't do it. There are theological reasons we can come up with that demonstrate how the appropriateness of Christ's decision, but the fundamental reason is Christ's decision. John chapter 4 should be really clear proof of that when Jesus meets a Samaritan woman at the well and reveals who he is to her, which is not something he usually does. He usually doesn't outright reveal himself as the Messiah in the Gospels. And the first people he reveals himself to after his resurrection are also women, even though a woman's word didn't even have a legal standing in court at the time. So Christ was obviously constantly willing to uphold the dignity of women, the personhood of women, not to just kowtow to the societal standards of the time. So it seems unlikely that he would have done so here when he picked his apostles. Moreover, the idea of a female priest or a clergywoman would not at all have been all that counterintuitive to a first century mind. There were a lot of priestesses in Roman religion and in paganism. Thus, as the Pope says, Christ would have acted in a completely free and sovereign manner in deciding to only select men to be his apostles. As Paul VI later explained, the real reason is that, in giving the Church her fundamental constitution, her theological anthropology, thereafter always followed by the Church's tradition, Christ established things in this way. That is the, quote, real reason, because Christ established it that way. JP2 continues, in the apostolic letter Mulieris Dignitatem, I myself wrote in this regard, in calling only men as his apostles, Christ acted in a completely free and sovereign manner. In doing so, he exercised the same freedom with which, in all his behavior, he emphasized the dignity and the vocation of women, without conforming to the prevailing customs and to the traditions sanctioned by the legislation of the time. In fact, the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles attest that this call was made in accordance with God's eternal plan. Christ chose those whom he willed, cf. Mark 3:13-14 and John 6:70, and he did so in union with the Father through the Holy Spirit, Acts 1 verse 2, after having spent the night in prayer, cf. Luke 6:12. Therefore, in granting admission to the ministerial priesthood, the Church has always acknowledged as a perennial norm her Lord's way of acting in choosing the 12 men whom he made the foundations of his Church, cf. Revelation 21:14. Notice how the Holy Father emphasizes this. Our Lord made this decision to ordain 12 men, and only 12 men, after a night in prayer, in union with the Holy Spirit and with the Father, so it's a decision that comes right from the very heart of the Trinity. And as it will say later in the document, it is the faithful observance of a plan to be ascribed to the wisdom of the Lord of the universe. So if you don't fully understand why exactly only men can be priests, understand that this comes from the eternal Logos, from the Sophia, which of course in Proverbs is anthropomorphized as a woman. The eternal wisdom of God, the logic undergirding the universe. If you don't fully understand it, that's fine. That's perfectly okay. But understand that that is where it comes from. A free and sovereign decision from the most sovereign, eternal God. It's a decision, in other words, that comes from eternity, from outside of time. It's not a decision that's conditioned by the social or cultural status or norms or mores of the time. It's an eternal decision. Now, that may be because there's something about masculinity and femininity that reflects the image of God, which is eternal, and that has some importance to the Church. But that's not what this video or this document is about. All that matters for the time being is we know it's an eternal decision, not one constrained by the era in which we encountered it in our temporal succession here on earth. It's an eternal decision from the heart of the Trinity. These men did not, in fact, receive only a function which could thereafter be exercised by any member of the Church. Rather, they were specifically and intimately associated in the mission of the incarnate Word himself. Cf. Matthew 10:1, 7-8, 28:16-20, and Mark 3:13-16, and 16:14-15. The apostles did the same when they chose their fellow workers, who would succeed them in their ministry. Also included in this choice were those who, throughout the time of the Church, would carry on the apostles' mission of representing Christ the Lord and Redeemer. Now this is important. The idea here is that this choice of the 12 men, this eternal choice, extended beyond them. It was supposed to be the perennial norm. This is why both the Oriental and the Western churches have never ordained women. Now, this is why I'm not necessarily that interested in the question of, well, was Junia in the Book of Romans a woman? And she's called an apostle if she was a woman. Or what about female deacons? When understanding a sacrament, we have to go back to the beginning, to the fundamental constitution. This is what Christ does with marriage. Did Moses permit divorce? Well, because of the hardness of your hearts, because of provisional situations, but the eternal design for marriage is the one seen in Genesis. In the same vein, could there have been female clergy persons in some capacities? Possibly, in some, there may be, historians may bear that out, theologians may bear that out, but the original fundamental design this is the Genesis, right? This is the Genesis 2 account of how the Sacrament of Holy Orders began, and that choice includes the fact that it is reserved to men alone, just like biological fatherhood is, any provisional exceptions notwithstanding. Furthermore, the fact that the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God and Mother of the Church, received neither the mission proper to the apostles nor the ministerial priesthood clearly shows that the non-admission of women to priestly ordination cannot mean that women are of lesser dignity, nor can it be construed as discrimination against them. Rather, it is to be seen as the faithful observance of a plan to be ascribed to the wisdom of the Lord of the universe. Now, this is an especially striking point from someone like John Paul II, who had a great devotion to Our Lady, to the point where he even made his personal crest a tribute to her, including the quote from St. Louis de Montfort, "Totus tuus," totally yours. This goes to prove the point that there's a certain element of clericalism in this whole insistence on women's ordination. We all know, that people default to thinking, oh, you're very holy. Oh, you're very interested in theology. Oh, you're very active with your church. Have you thought of becoming a priest? The fact that we kind of default to that, in some ways, is probably a sign that we're all kind of closet clericalists. Oh, well, you're holy. That means you should be a priest. Well, as this document will go on to say later, priesthood exists in order that Christians may be holy. Holiness is the point. Priesthood isn't. The presence and the role of women in the church, and the life and mission of the church, although not linked to the ministerial priesthood, remain absolutely necessary and irreplaceable. Notice how this document keeps saying specifically the ministerial priesthood. This is to distinguish it. Every Catholic woman, every baptized Catholic woman, is a priest. There is the common priesthood of all believers, a doctrine that is sometimes thought to have been discovered by the Reformation, but no, it's part of the deposit of faith in Catholicism. That's different than the ministerial priesthood, and one traditional great error is the error of clericalism, which is to say that the only way to exercise power or authority, or the only channel for holiness, the only avenue for a true Christian, is to become a priest. That kind of thinking is implicit on the insistence that women can be priests, and it's a danger that later parts of this document will attempt to steer the Church away from. As the Declaration Inter Insigniores points out, quote, "The Church desires that Christian women should become fully aware of the greatness of their mission. Today, their role is of capital importance, both for the renewal and humanization of society, and for the rediscovery by believers of the true face of the Church. The New Testament and the whole history of the Church give ample evidence of the presence of the Church in the Church of women, true disciples, witnesses to Christ in the family and in society, as well as in total consecration to the service of God and of the gospel." Okay, well, speaking of this, there's a video on YouTube in defense of women's ordination in the Catholic Church. You might have seen it.
Just flowing where you think the church is going. Hey, I was baptized, and this is crazy, but God just called me, so ordain a lady.
If you haven't seen it, I don't really recommend you watch it, but the way it opens is kind of interesting.
I had a dream as a girl, like Therese of Lisieux. I need to give this a whirl so I can lead the way.
Okay, now if you're going to use St. Therese of Lisieux as your kind of poster child for a woman who wanted to be a priest, and now she's going to be kind of your patron saint, if you will, of women's ordination, let's look at Father Barron explaining what she was talking about when she discussed her desire to become a priest, and what she took away from that.
Toward the end of her life, Therese experienced the intense desire to do all the things the great figures in the history of the Church had done. She said, "I wanted to be priest, martyr, missionary, evangelist, and doctor." Then she thought, how could I possibly be any of these things in my little monastery here in Carmel? Then she read Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, and she was struck by that magnificent passage where Paul talks about the more excellent way, the way of love. Therese realized in a flash that love was the form of all the virtues. Love was what made the lives of all the saints possible. Love was what undergirded the work of priest, missionary, evangelist, doctor. And so she said, Jesus, my love, I found my vocation. I will be love in the heart of the church.
This is so important. St. Therese realized that her desire to be a priest was really a desire to love. Really, the way that she could fulfill that vocation was to love. And she learned this from the same passage of Scripture that the Holy Father will quote just a few lines from now. And notice, too, how different her attitude was when you study her life to the attitude of, say, the Philadelphia 11. She didn't insist on her right to be a nun. She begged her bishop for permission. She went to the Pope and begged him for permission. She wouldn't do anything without their sanction. She always did everything with the church because she strove, to be the heart of the church. This is an important point. Always notice what the spirit is behind any theological movement, behind any liturgical movement, behind any ecclesial movement. Is it one that sounds more like the canonic hymn of Philippians, where Christ emptied himself and was submissive, or does it sound more like Eve, grasping at equality with God? By defending the dignity of women and their vocation, the Church has shown honor and gratitude for those women who, faithful to the gospel, have shared in every age the apostolic mission of the whole people of God. They are the holy martyrs, virgins, and the mothers of families who bravely bore witness to their faith and passed on the Church's faith and tradition by bringing up their children in the spirit of the gospel. Moreover, it is to the holiness of the faithful that the hierarchical structure of the Church is totally ordered. For this reason, the Declaration Inter Insigniores recalls, "The only better gift which can and must be desired is love." See 1 Corinthians 12 and 13. The greatest in the kingdom of heaven are not the ministers, but the saints. Anytime you discuss anything about the Church, propose any change, criticize anything in the hierarchy, and it isn't all centered on the question of, is this going to make the people of God holier? Then you're doing it wrong. The document ends this way. Although the teaching that priestly ordination is to be reserved to men alone has been preserved by the constant and universal tradition of the Church and firmly taught by the magisterium in its more recent documents, at the present time, in some places, it nonetheless is considered still open to debate, or the Church's judgment that women are not to be admitted to ordination is considered to have a merely disciplinary force. Wherefore, in order that all doubt may be removed regarding a matter of great importance, a matter which pertains to the Church's divine constitution itself, in virtue of my ministry of confirming the brethren, cf. Luke 22:32, I declare that the Church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women, and that this judgment is to be definitively held by all the Church's faithful, invoking an abundance of divine assistance upon you, venerable brothers, and upon all the faithful I impart my apostolic blessing. From the Vatican on the 22nd of May, the Solemnity of Pentecost in the year 1994, the 16th of my pontificate. Now, this is the language of infallibility. The First Vatican Council says that we teach and define as a divinely revealed dogma that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, that is, when in the exercise of his office as the shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole Church, he possesses by the divine assistance promised him in Blessed Peter that infallibility which the divine Redeemer willed his Church to enjoy in defining doctrine concerning faith or morals. Therefore, such definitions of the Roman Pontiff are of themselves, and not by the consent of the Church, irreformable. So, Richard McBrien's kind of argument that, well, it's not infallible because it wasn't necessarily accepted by the congregation, by the community of the faithful, if I understand his argument, doesn't hold water when compared to what the First Vatican Council clearly says. And moreover, the Holy Father said specifically, I'm issuing this declaration so that all doubt will be removed. If there was a doubt about its infallibility, how would that be effective? How would that even be meaningful? So there it is. That's Pope John Paul II's definitive statement, infallibly, that women can never be ordained because the Church just hasn't received the authority from God to ordain them. In other videos, I'd like to talk more about why that might be, but this is the fact. The fact is that it is. It's been clearly laid down because the Church is trying to imitate Jesus and follow the precedent that he set and follow the laws that he instituted. If you want to kind of understand more about this, read then Cardinal Ratzinger's letter explaining the declaration. Read more of it for yourself. I'll talk to you later. Take care.